Bradley J. Birzer is the Russell Amos Kirk Professor in American Studies at Hillsdale College. He earned his BA from the University of Notre Dame and his MA and Ph.D. from Indiana University. He serves on the board of the Free Enterprise Institute and the Center for Cultural Renewal. He also serves as fellow or scholar at the Foundation for Economic Education, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, the McConnell Center, and the Center for Economic Personalism. He has written for numerous publications, including the Imaginative Conservative, a site he co-founded, Ignatius Insight, National Review, and Catholic World Report. He is the author of several books, including J.R.R. Tolkien's Sanctifying Myth, Understanding Middle-earth, American Cicero, The Life of Charles Carroll, and In Defense of Andrew Jackson. Please welcome Dr. Birzer.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I am very honored to be here and to start off this CCA. I've never been asked to speak at a CCA as an actual participant during the lectures. My department chair, who's been very gracious and has been dean of faculty, has asked me to speak on faculty roundtables before, but this is the first time I actually get to speak, and I get to speak as the first speaker, which is really exciting in all kinds of ways. So Jason, thank you so much for that introduction, and I also would like to thank Matt Bell for inviting me, being the head of the CCAs, Doug Jeffrey, Vice President for External Affairs, also for inviting me, and for the entire staff at External Affairs. Obviously, we would not be here without what they're doing. This is fantastic. I do also want to point out over there, though I can't see right now because of the lighting, my beautiful wife, my lovely wife, Deidre, is right over here, and she's been bouncing, or allowing me to bounce ideas off of her for several years now, actually, maybe more than we would care to admit, and she's been great. I also want to point out my very lovely my manly department chair, Mark Kaltoff back there as well, for being very supportive. Okay, and I have to point out two other people. Tom Connor is here, and he will be on the faculty roundtable, and I actually have nothing good to say about him. I just want to make sure that when it comes to his turn to talk about my speech, he knows I recognized him. So we will leave it at that. Okay, on a very serious note. As many of you may know, when Andrew Jackson took the oath of office for the very first time on March 4th of 1829, he did so wearing all black. He was still lamenting the very recent loss of his wife, his partner, his absolute intellectual equal. He also, when he gave his talk, when he gave his inaugural, he bowed twice to the American people. Once when he started and once when he finished his talks, and both times he recognized that they were the true sovereigns of America. This was not affectation or theater on his part. One of the things that astounded me absolutely in getting to write on Andrew Jackson is how unbelievably honest he was and how unbelievably dedicated he was to the American people. So in 2017, and I don't want to make this too autobiographical about me, but in 2017, I got asked through John Miller, who teaches here at the college. He was asked by Harry Crocker, who was the head then of Regnery Publishing, if they knew somebody who could write a very quick and short biography of Andrew Jackson. I've been teaching Andrew Jackson during a class that we have here at Hillsdale College for the last 21 years, since 1999. I've been teaching a course called Jacksonian America, and throughout most of the time that I had the privilege of teaching that course, which I absolutely loved, there are incredible figures like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau and John Quincy Adams. During much of that, I always taught Andrew Jackson as the bad guy. He was the first really strong executive. This was a person who tried to distort what the founders wanted. He was our 7th president. He was the first non-classically educated sophisticated president. He was kind of a country bumpkin. He was an Indian murderer. And I taught him basically as that for roughly 18 years of my career here at Hillsdale College. So when John Miller and Harry Crocker asked me to write about Andrew Jackson, I was kind of taken aback. I wasn't quite sure if I could do this because I know that they wanted a pretty positive biography, especially because Donald Trump had been making all kinds of claims very recently, especially on Andrew Jackson's 250th birthday, about the greatness of that president. And I knew that Regnery wanted to kind of compare Andrew Jackson to Donald Trump. And I decided to go ahead because I got from Harry Crocker an assurance that I could write whatever I wanted as long as I was able to back it up. I found very quickly that I fell in love with Andrew Jackson almost immediately. Of all the people I've had the privilege to write on, and I've written only upon people that I really like, I found that I got to know Andrew Jackson better than almost every other figure that I've been able to write about. And the reason was because he speaks so openly. There is no duplicity in his language, in his mind. I actually think it would go constitutionally against the very character and the very soul and person of Andrew Jackson to be duplicitous. Now, he's also the most brutal person I have ever come across in my own life in terms of studying someone this intimately. So he was both incredibly honest and incredibly brutal. And I had to come to grips with that. What is it about this man and what is it about his brutality that in many ways plays into his honesty? And what is it about his honesty that plays into his brutality? What I wasn't expecting, and partly because I was in grad school during the 1990s, what I wasn't expecting was the vigorous pushback that I was going to get from academics in even quasi-praising any aspect of Andrew Jackson. When I was in college, I graduated college in 1990 and I finished grad school in 1999. When I was in college and graduate school, Andrew Jackson was still very well regarded within the history profession. In fact, a poll among historians in 1996 revealed that most American historians still regarded Andrew Jackson as one of the 5 most important and best presidents in the United States. Now, that's amazing, because if you go back now in 2020 and you were to ask historians what they think of Andrew Jackson, he'll be probably in the bottom 10 to 15. His star has fallen dramatically. And I was told in no uncertain terms, both in interviews on the radio as well as in critiques of my own book, that defending Andrew Jackson was no better than defending Adolf Hitler. I do not exaggerate. I was told this several times. Of course, they never bring up Stalin, and I thought, well, if you're going to get nasty, bring Stalin up, but they didn't. All right, he's too left, so only Hitler would do in the criticism. But I was told that Andrew Jackson was a rapist. It's not true. I was told he was a murderer. It's not true. And I was told he was an ethnic cleanser. It's not true. Fascinating. What so many people believe about Andrew Jackson. And what struck me, even in the pushback on Andrew Jackson, was how absolutely mythic this character is. He is either, in American history, and has been, either a kind of heroic demigod, the great flag embodied, or he has been a demon. In his own days, he was called a knight in buckskin, the Napoleon of the woods, Old Hickory, and the greatest title that any American could have held prior to the 20th century. He was the hero of New Orleans. Those were all very nice accolades. These were great things that we saw about his character. And I can't help but think that there's a kind of American stereotype, in the good way, about who Andrew Jackson was. He is like this kind of unrealistic but fascinating American character. He is really the frontier personified. I couldn't help but think of Johnny Ringo in Stagecoach, that great John Ford movie. And I couldn't help but think of The Innocence of Johnny Ringo. For those of you who've seen Stagecoach, and if you haven't recently, you should, one of the great classics in American cinema. Johnny Ringo, this young gunfighter, finds himself on a stagecoach with a whole variety of different people from different parts of society. And one of the persons on the stagecoach is a prostitute. And Johnny Ringo doesn't get that. He just knows that she's a fancy woman, and she's a woman, and he needs to treat her in a certain way. The other woman on the stagecoach is deeply offended by this. I'll come back to why this is important, especially for Andrew Jackson. Or I think of John Wayne again as Ethan Edwards in The Searchers, another John Ford movie. John Ford and John Wayne understood something about this unique character, the man who loses, the man who struggles no matter the cost, but no matter the loss and no matter the struggle, he continues to fight for what's right because he knows that's at the essence of what it means to be an American male. But we could jump forward a little bit as well. And now I'm probably revealing my own age because I certainly wasn't around when Stagecoach or The Searchers came out. But I was very much alive and rather in love with a science fiction story called Firefly in the early 2000s, about 20 years ago. And for those of you who've seen that, it is a Western set in space. And the main figure is a John Wayne kind of figure by the name of Malcolm Reynolds. And there's a great moment in the pilot of that show. The show only lasted, I think, 16 episodes. They did 13 for the pilot season and then another 3, and it failed, and then they made a movie. It's unfortunate that it failed, but it's one of those things. I'm glad it existed at all. But there's a moment where a young doctor comes up to the captain of the ship, the Firefly, or the Serenity, a Firefly-class ship, and this character, Malcolm Reynolds, is challenged. And the doctor says, after all the violence I've seen, are you going to shoot me? And Malcolm Reynolds says something to him that's incredible. And Andrew Jackson could have said it. He says, "You don't know me, son, so let me explain it to you once. If I ever kill you, you'll be awake, you'll be facing me, and you'll be armed." Now that's the ultimate American male statement in terms of understanding what it means to be a small r Republican, a believer in a republic, and to be an American. I think that captures the essence of it. Now, it's not a normal statement, and yet it's unbelievably American. And for me, this is what Andrew Jackson was all about. So I want to make 5 points today talking about character and leadership in Andrew Jackson. So Andrew Jackson is born in 1767, and he dies in 1845. It's a pretty amazing life. When you think about everything that he went through, he was born into absolute poverty, Scotch-Irish poverty in every way. He was able to work his way up into the world, even though he had lost the entirety of his family by the time he was 14. He was able to work his way up out of poverty and into not just respectable middle class, but Southern gentry status in Nashville, Tennessee, which I would argue was as Western and frontier as it was Southern during the age of Andrew Jackson. Again, those two qualities coming together, that violence of the frontier and that honor of being a Scotch-Irish American. But I want to point out 5 things about Andrew Jackson as we think about him and his career. Number 1, I think very importantly, he was all of his life a small r Republican. He believed in the essence of a republic. He was a Presbyterian, and he was Scotch-Irish. And I think in many ways, that identification of his ethnicity and his religion and his politics reveals much about who the man was. His mother, as I mentioned, died when he was young. He was only 14. And his mother died because she was nursing American soldiers during the American Revolution and caught a fever and was not able to overcome it. But she did leave some advice for Andrew, whom she hoped would grow up to be a Presbyterian minister. It was actually one reason that they saved up their money, very little that they had, for Andrew to be able to go to a liberal arts college when he was a young man. He didn't use the money for that. It went for other things. Andrew Jackson did end up having somewhat of a classical education, but as he himself said, everything that he ever needed to know, he learned by reading stories of William Wallace, the great Scottish nationalist. And there's something to that, especially when we think about Andrew Jackson. But here's what his mother wrote him before she died as a piece of advice. So point number 1, being Republican, Scotch-Irish, Presbyterian, and being the son of this woman. Andrew, if I should never see you again, I wish you to remember and treasure up some things that I have already said to you. In this world, you always have to make your own way. To do that, you have to have friends. You must make friends by being honest, and you must keep them by being steadfast. You must keep in mind that friends worth having will in the long run expect as much from you as they give to you. To forget an obligation or to be ungrateful for a kindness is a base crime, not merely a fault or a sin, but an actual crime. Men guilty of this crime sooner or later suffer the penalty. In personal conduct, be always polite, but never obsequious. None will respect you more than you will ever respect yourself. Avoid quarrels as long as you can without yielding to imposition, but sustain your manhood always. Never bring a suit of law for assault or battery or defamation to a courtroom. The law affords no remedy for such outrages that can satisfy the feelings of a true man. Everybody catch that? You beat the snot out of your opponent on the street. You don't take him to court. Right? This is what it means to be a real man of the law. Never wound the feelings of another. Never brook wanton outrage upon your own feelings. If you ever have to vindicate your feelings or defend your honor, do it calmly. And then, if angry, wait until your wrath cools before you proceed. Now, what motherly advice, right? There we have it. And Andrew loves this. This is everything to him. And one of the most fascinating things I found in going through the life of Andrew Jackson was how much, to an almost surrealistic degree, he respected women. Now, this is a great thing, right? We should respect women. Men should respect women. But Jackson took this to the point where his mother and his wife, who is his intellectual equal in every way and his partner, he took it so far that I have never seen anyone in history think so highly of a woman, except for maybe Roman Catholics in the way they approach the Virgin Mary. And I say that without any kind of recrimination, just straightforward. Jackson had a great reverence for women. So if you remember, I brought up a little bit ago, Johnny Ringo on the Stagecoach. We find letters in Andrew Jackson's collected letters where he wrote to the prostitutes of Nashville, Tennessee, inviting them to the town balls, not as dates, but as equals, because they too were citizens, or at least residents, of Nashville. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't meant in any way to be derogatory. Andrew truly believed that this was how you treated women. And we could say, and this was something that was brought up against Andrew Jackson in his own lifetime and today, well, what about black women? He was a slave owner. We have the testimony of one of his slaves, Hannah, who said that every time Andrew Jackson came to the plantation, everybody celebrated. He solved problems. He served as a judge. He treated all of his slaves with respect. He rolled up his shirt sleeves and worked with them in every way. And not only that, but when Rachel Jackson passed away in 1829 and Jackson had to leave his estate to go up to Washington to be president, he left Hannah, his black slave, in charge of the estate for the 8 years that he was gone. It's pretty impressive. Kind of complicates our view of slavery, doesn't it? There it is. Very, very interesting. Point number 2 about Andrew Jackson. As I mentioned earlier, Jackson was as honest as he was violent. And one of the things that shocked me to no end, and I will admit, I'm from Kansas, I'm a Volga German, Russian German stock. My family refused to fight during World War I, which my wife's family still likes to tease me about because they have fought in every encounter America's been in, I think going back to like Queen Anne's War. So they have been in everything, and very proudly so. My family has done everything to dodge war in every way. So this is not from my background in Kansas, but I think about the complex set of rules that went around dueling during the 1800s and how complicated this was. Andrew Jackson once said, "For malicious slander, all men are answered only at the bar of honor." Now think about what his mother told him. Anytime you're wronged, you never take it to court. You settle it in the street. That's what real men do. And that's exactly what Andrew Jackson did. But there's something about Jackson's duels that are absolutely fascinating. The duels dictated that no people ever of unequal worth could challenge one another in a duel. And Jackson has in his own letters and his diaries that when younger men who were clearly trying to make their way in society and prove their worth within Scotch-Irish society, when they would challenge Jackson, Jackson would actually go up to them in the street with his cane and just beat them. He would tell them, you're not worthy of a duel, but someday you will be. And it was actually to be caned by Andrew Jackson was regarded as a good thing. And here's why. Because it meant that you would mean something someday, even if you don't yet. If Jackson ignored you, that was the worst thing possible. Here's one of the most interesting comments, and I'll give you two stories about Jackson and dueling. When he was in the U.S. Senate, and he only served twice in the U.S. Senate, and neither for a full term, just a couple of years, in the 1790s and then again in the 1820s, he just served for about 2 years each. But the first time that he was in during John Adams' administration, and he was absolutely disgusted by a fight that was going on, not a real fight, but a political argument going on the floor of the Senate that lasted for 16 days. And Jackson writes in his diary, I don't get this. These men are effete. This is all sticks and spittle. We have spent 16 days of the people's money spending $10,000 for this debate, and what an absolute disgrace. They could have easily solved it by a quick duel outside of Congress. Now, he means this. This is not a joke on his part, right? This is the way men settle things. And I have to admit, and I don't consider myself an extremely violent person, but when I looked at how complicated the rules were in society and how detailed the instructions were on who you could fight and who you couldn't fight, there is something honorable in what Jackson is advocating. I'm not calling for a return. Please, I can see people now. Hillsdale Professor calls for a return to dueling. This is not what I'm doing. But I do want to put it into the context of the times that there is something fascinating about what's going on. But here's my favorite challenge. Andrew Jackson, as you may know, was extremely intelligent, but not very well educated. And one of the funniest things about going through his letters is he never spells the same word the same way twice, right? And I think he would have considered it a badge of dishonor had he been able to spell consistently. But he would write these challenges in the Nashville newspaper where he would say, because of this person's actions, I challenge this person to a duel for whatever reason, and he would list it, and then he would say, I call on this person to give me a time and a date. And one of the persons that he got into a fight with was the governor, John Sevier. And so they were trying to figure out a time, and they kept sending, and I've seen all these notes, they're hilarious. They keep sending these notes back to each other saying, well, I think we should fight by longsword, we'll do it at this place at this time. Other one will write back, no, longsword's not appropriate. I say we use this caliber pistol. We'll do it at this time. And this went on for weeks. And Jackson got really frustrated. And so he finally published in the newspaper, to all whom shall see this, present greetings. Know ye that I, Andrew Jackson, do pronounce, publish, and declare to the world that the excellency, John Sevier, your governor, captain general, commander-in-chief of the land and naval forces of the state of Tennessee, is a base coward. He will basely insult, but he has not the courage to repair the wound. Now, there's the final statement. And so Sevier agrees, and they come up on a time, and Jackson is anxious about this duel. And they have to duel right on the Tennessee-Kentucky border. They don't want to be either exactly in Kentucky or Tennessee in case the law decides to get involved. So they pick this spot on the Kentucky-Tennessee border. Jackson shows up early. He's got his number 2. You always have a second with you in case you fall who can pick up the fight. And he sees, about 15 minutes late, Sevier riding in on a horse with a friend, his number 2, and Jackson is furious because the guy's late. And so Jackson pulls his cane. Remember the cane? He pulls his cane out and he charges Sevier. Charges him across this field. And Sevier is so befuddled by this that he tries to pull his sword out. But in the act of trying to pull his sword out, he falls off his horse, and he falls onto the ground on top of his sword, and his sword breaks in two. Jackson comes up to him and says, "I see you removed your sword. I consider this duel satisfied." They shook hands, rode back to Nashville together, and became constant allies for the rest of each of their career. How do we explain this in politically correct 2020, right? Can you imagine on Twitter? Oh, you scoundrel. All right, point number 3, and specifically about the context of this great CCA on character and leadership in the military. One of the most interesting things about Andrew Jackson that I think we often don't remember about him is that he actually had a great animosity towards the standing army, even though he was a general within the standing army. He wrote constantly throughout his life. He wrote lots of letters. He didn't write a lot of public documents, but he did a few. And in these statements that he wrote about the standing army, he had kind of the old-fashioned small r Republican notion that a true republic will be defended by its navy, it can be permanent, but never by a standing army, which is almost always the tool of oppression, as he thought. He said there are really only 2 reasons to call up the army, and you never have it for more than 2 years, right? And this is in the Constitution. We know that no bill that gives revenue to the army can last for more than 2 years. There are no such restrictions on the Navy, but there is that in the U.S. Constitution. Jackson said there are only 2 reasons we would ever call up the standing army. Number 1, if the Indians are harassing us, or number 2, if the Europeans are, right? He's not expecting anyone else, but if the Europeans or the Indians. And even then, when we call up the standing army, we always put limitations on it, and we always make sure that the militia is superior to the standing army. Here he is in 1805, during his July 4th toast in Tennessee. He says, and this is toast number, I did not write this. It's toast number 7. And it actually mattered, the number of toast, because I'll read you 7 and then 11. So toast number 7. To the militias of the United States, the surest bulwark of freedom. And then number 11. To the Army of the United States, which we must always remember can be doomed to persecution and tyranny under a government of laws to satiate the private spleen of any would-be despot. So that's pretty amazing, right? We're praising the army, but not really, because we don't know exactly what that army is going to do. 5 years later, in 1810, he explained his own position in a letter to the governor of Tennessee. He says, "Our independence and liberty as a people was not obtained without expense. It was dearly bought with blood and treasure, and it must be preserved. The pence on this subject can never be counted, but the only real and substantial defense of a free people is the organized militia." This is always, and I quote from Jackson, in contrast with the corruption manifested at all times in our regular army. And this has been verified by our Constitution, which only allows the 2-year funding for things in the Army. In 1812 and 1813, when Andrew Jackson called up his own private militia and state army within Tennessee, he told them that no matter what, he assured them, he would not allow the federal government to federalize them in any way. He said to his men in March of 1812, there will be no drafts or compulsory levies, and if they are made, there will be a simple invitation to those who buy into that idea to leave to us the fighting. So, if you've been drafted, if you're here against your will, we'll ask you to leave. Jackson, when he was told by the Secretary of War that he must federalize his troops, he refused. And he said, "This is not what I promised the parents of these young men. These young men are here strictly because they believe the fight is correct." And he refused to follow the order of John Armstrong, then the Secretary of War. And he said, "I would remind you of your own army's success. Was it not under the U.S. Army command of William Hull at Detroit in 1812 that you surrendered 1/3 of our forces to the British?" Where is your glorious army? And by what right do you have to regulate my militia? He says, a nobler feeling should impel us to action. Who are we? What are we going to fight for? Are we the slaves of George III? This is in 1813. Are we the slaves of George III? Or the military conscripts of Napoleon? Or the frozen peasants of the Russian Tsar? No, we are free-born sons of the Republic of America, the citizens of the only republic now existing in the world and the only people on earth who possess rights, liberty, and property which they dare call their own. It's amazing. And think about that. And I hope, this is one of those things we rarely teach in our classrooms, I hope we have to understand and explain that this is a different world. And when Jackson is against the military, in this kind of audience that I have right here in front of me, this is odd to us. But when we imagine what the history of standing armies had been at the time that Jackson speaks in 1812 and 1813, we can understand why he's so hesitant about this. But he takes this even further. When he is inaugurated on March 4th of 1829, he will not allow any military officers to be present. And if they're present, they may not be in uniform. But he does invite all the militias of the present day and of all those who fought during the Revolutionary War to come and parade. And he walks with them during his inaugural. That's astounding in all kinds of ways. Okay, point number 4. Well, despite this, Andrew Jackson is one of the greatest victors in U.S. history. And we can think about what he did on January 8th of 1815. And I would remind everyone here that Jackson's force was a force of only 2,000 that he had at the Battle of New Orleans. And it was Jackson almost alone who understood that after the British had invaded in the Great Lakes and then up the Chesapeake, their next venue would be Mississippi. Very few people believed that was going to be the case. We were in the middle of signing a peace in the fall and early winter of 1814 with Britain. Britain had just concluded hostilities by defeating Napoleon, and we thought this was it. Jackson knew better. He knew that the British would do one last thing. We also know this, that when the British were given orders and there were 14,000 troops being carried on 60 ships under the leadership of Ned Pakenham coming from Britain, these were all Napoleonic soldiers, battle-hardened. These were not draftees. These were not new recruits. These were men who had seen much action in Europe throughout the Napoleonic Wars. And they had express permission from both Parliament and the King that when they were to attack, it was not to be a harassment raid, it was to be an attack to reclaim property all along the Mississippi River. That's something we often forget about in history. This was not meant to be some harassment run. The British were here for blood and for our soil. And Jackson understood this. He knew that this was coming. And so he, in what would resemble modern trench warfare, what we will see at Petersburg during the Civil War, or what we'll see at the Battle of the Somme and other great battles in World War I, he created massive trenches waiting for the British to come. And again, I'll remind us of that force. Jackson has just a little over 2,000 men, all recruits, all free. He refused to allow any draftees with him at all. He would be he would find that abhorrent. So he has only about 2,000 men, but they are in great battle-hardened mode behind these trenches and these dugouts. Well, one of my favorite historians, who was actually a journalist before he became a historian, Paul Johnson, writes in his excellent book from 1991, The Birth of the Modern, he describes how terrible the British were in executing this plan at New Orleans. He says, the great Duke of Wellington, Pakenham, had married his sister Catherine, but that was the closest that man had ever gotten to any military mastery. Money and connections had made Pakenham a major before he was 17 and a colonel at age 21. There was no question of his courage. Serving as a major general under his brother-in-law at Salamanca in 1812, he had been given the chance when Wellington told him to take his division straight at the French center with the words, "Now's your time, Ned." Ned broke through the French line, and this, Wellington said in a dispatch, won the battle, though he admitted, quote, Pakenham may not be the brightest of geniuses. He launched a full frontal assault on Jackson's position on January 8th of 1815. Andrew Jackson, in his own report, says that he had about 10 of his own men killed and about 10 wounded total. 20 casualties out of 2,000. The British that day lost 1,500 Marines and another 500 who were taken prisoner. Imagine that. There were close to 44 bodies that were so decimated in the Gulf of Mexico that they could not find the remains of them. They couldn't identify. This is incredible. And what do we have and what comes out of this? And this is where, no matter what, even if we remembered Andrew Jackson for nothing else, he is the hero of New Orleans. Was he lucky? Maybe. Was he smart? Maybe. Did he win? He won. Brutally. He won. And so what does Paul Johnson say? Paul Johnson, who is British himself, says, this was the great moment in Anglo-American relations. It was at this moment alone that the British finally took us seriously as a country. It was at this moment that the great Anglo-American alliance, which had lasted and still does up till 2020, but certainly at the time that Johnson wrote this in 1991, this was the beginning of our mutual respect with each other. And you think about Andrew Jackson, he's now as great as William Wallace. He's now as great as James Wolfe. He is truly one of the great generals in history at that point. And more than any other title he had, the title that meant the most to him and the one that meant the most to Americans always was that he was the hero of New Orleans. Finally, point number 5, and I'll conclude with this and we'll open it up for questions. One of my favorite things about Andrew Jackson. So today, you'll have to forgive me for this, but I wore, and I don't know how many of you can see this, but I wore my grandfather, who was the best man I ever knew. He died in 1982, but I wore his campaign button for Dwight D. Eisenhower from, I don't know if it's from 52 or 56, but it's from one of those elections. And I've had it with me. I've never worn it before. This is the first time I've worn it. And I thought, we're here to talk about character. We're here to talk about American generals. What better figure other than Andrew Jackson than Dwight D. Eisenhower? You know, what a great thing. And I grew up in Kansas. I've been to the Eisenhower Museum a million times, so you guys will please forgive me. I've already given you Jackson's views on the military, and they're probably not so well taken necessarily in this audience, and understandably so. But I would also give another view of Andrew Jackson, and something that I think we often forget but should remember. At the end of Andrew Jackson's life, he died in 1845, as I mentioned earlier. People, his friends, offered to build him a mausoleum so that they could dedicate at least some memorial to him as hero of New Orleans and as President of the United States. And Jackson writes them back, and he says, I am so honored that you would want to remember me after my death, but I must decline any memorial. My own Republican feelings and my principles of republicanism forbid it, and the simplicity of our way of life as a republic should forbid it. True virtue cannot exist where pomp and parade are governing passions. It can only dwell with the people, the great laboring and producing classes that form the bone and the sinew of our republic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Birzer.
You're welcome, wherever you are. I'm sorry, I really can't see.
I'm right over here.
Oh, there you are.
Yes.
Thank you.
We now have time for Q&A. Please make your way to the microphone if you have a question. Sorry, do you have a question? Please stand up. And then can you come over? And then sorry.
Sure.
Doctor, could you say something about the Bank of the United States?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that, please?
Could you say something about Jackson and the Bank of the United States?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So the question about Jackson and the Bank of the United States is a great one because obviously, and that's not something I focused on since we're dealing with military history, but it's related. Andrew Jackson, in his honesty, and I think we could probably debate this, but people at the Mises Institute and Ron Paul would agree with this. Jackson's argument was essentially that money must be real. If it's not actual specie, that is, if it's not based on a physical commodity, it's a lie. This was part of Jackson's honesty, and he was a gold man in every way, gold, silver, whatever it is that we wanted to trade in, but it had to be a commodity. And so from the very beginning of the first Bank of the United States, Jackson had vehemently opposed it. When he was a young man, he opposed the second Bank of the United States. And of course, when he's president, he can actually do something about this. And when the Whigs try to outmaneuver him during his first administration and have the bank come up 4 years early for renewal, for a 20-year renewal, Jackson uses this to solidify his own power. In fact, in some ways, Jackson really becomes Jackson as president after his victory against the Second Bank of the United States. And he makes two arguments. He says, number one, ultimately, this is a lie. Paper money is always and everywhere a lie. Even if you could have paper money effective for a certain amount of time, it will always become corrupt at some point because it's not worth anything. It's only worth what we state it's worth, and therefore it can't have any longevity. But the second point he made to this was a very interesting one, and one I think that those of us who love the free market, should remember. His argument was that power rarely benefits the poor. It almost always benefits the rich. And what was the Second Bank of the United States founded for? Not to create equality among the peoples of America, but to give privilege to the wealthy. And he actually argued through much of his own arguments on government privilege that that's the thing that we must most be concerned about. The poor will always be here, they will come and go, but they'll never really have any long-term say over the government, he thought, but the rich would. And we had to be very careful of that. But he's coming from a radically laissez-faire argument on that, which I find very interesting. So thank you for that question. I'm sorry. Where is that coming from here? No. Me there?
Sorry, the question is to the speaker's left.
Professor,
Sure.
My name is Gordon Austin. I'm a retired naval officer, and I came from Georgia specifically to hear this series, and I want to compliment you on getting it off to such a good start.
Thank you.
You alluded to what my question is at the beginning. I recently visited the Hermitage, and I was struck by the comparison between Donald Trump and Andrew Jackson, especially in contemporary descriptions of Jackson. Could you expound on that?
Sure. So one of the reasons that I did write my book was simply because there was so much interest in Trump being interested in Jackson. And if you go back and look, Donald Trump gave a speech on Andrew Jackson's 250th birthday, and it's actually one of Trump's more really well-done speeches. I don't think it would compare. The one that he gave at the Right to Life March was, if we remember him for anything, it will be for that speech, which was probably written by a Hillsdale graduate, Brittany Baldwin, most likely. She is his speechwriter on all things religious, so I assume that she can't take credit for that. So I will give her credit. I'm pretty sure she's the one who wrote that, and amen. But the speech he gave on Jackson was really quite interesting. Now it's 3 years old, coming up on 3 years. And there have been a lot of questions about what's the similarity. And most of the people who are commenting on the similarities have done so because they both come at these populist moments, these moments where people are trying to take back what's going on in Washington, D.C. There's no question, I can't speak as effectively on Trump. There is no doubt that when Andrew Jackson went to D.C., he cleaned the place up. Andrew Jackson actually has a squeaky clean record. We may not always agree with his policies. I heard someone yell out the Trail of Tears, and yeah, there's no real defense of that. There's an explanation, but not a defense of it. It's heinous. But when we look at his there practices, he's squeaky clean. We don't have examples of corruption in his administration at all. And there were things like he put in charge of all the bureaucrats in Washington. He put a guy in charge by the name of Amos Kendall. And Kendall used to walk around from office to office. And if he thought anybody was wasting government time, if they were reading a newspaper or a novel, or if they were just sitting there, he fired them. You can't do this. You're on the people's dime. You're working or you're out. And there's no doubt Jackson spent his 8 years in Washington cleaning things out. And if I remember correctly, he's the only president outside of Clinton to have fully balanced the budget. And he was very effective at this, and a lot of it had to do with these policies of corruption. I don't think Trump has been quite as effective, but there are reasons for that. The bureaucracy is much deeper than it was under Andrew Jackson. Things were still very politicized under Andrew Jackson. You either were the follower of the president or you weren't, and if you weren't, you lost your job. And it didn't matter if you were in D.C. or a postal carrier, you were out. And so there was no civil service tenure other than what the president said if you're in an executive office. The other thing that they have in common, of course, is they're both Scottish. And they have that kind of tendency to speak off the cuff at times. They also are interesting, and I don't want to get too political about this, but when it comes to women, they both have interesting relations with women. But I would say Jackson's were a lot more traditional than Trump's have been. So I don't want to get too much more into detail about that. But yeah. So I don't know if that answers you, but their policies they're not totally that similar. I mean, when we think about Jackson being so anti-military and so pro-free trade and so laissez-faire, I think Trump's been really good on the laissez-faire part, especially with the regulatory offices. But at those other things, I mean, he's clearly not been free trade by any means, good or bad, that he's different from Jackson in that way. So thank you very much for your question.
Over here.
Question to the speaker.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for your talk. At the very in your introductory remarks, you talked about the reputation of Jackson being a rapist and an Indian murderer. And I really know nothing about Jackson's, but could you talk where did those stories come from if they weren't true?
So a lot of them came from his political opponents at the time. They used to report things like this. They'd have Jackson for president. Do you want a murderer in the White House? Things like that. But we do remember him, and there's no easy defense of this. I mean, he clearly is responsible for the removal of thousands upon thousands of Indians from their traditional homelands to the West, and they were removed. If they were from the southern states, they were removed to Oklahoma. And from the northern places like here, Hillsdale, when the Potawatomis were removed, they're removed to Kansas around Topeka. And he is responsible for that. Now, we can look at his arguments. He did believe very strongly that removal was a preferable option to keeping them where they would keep getting surrounded and outpopulated by those of European descent. But the execution of the removal was heinous. When we look, for example, at the Choctaw Indians, one of the 5 major tribes of the South that was removed to Oklahoma, when they were removed in 1831 and 1832, they started off with 18,000 people in their tribe. A year later, they were down to 6,000. They lost 2/3 of their people in the removal. There's no defense of that. I think a lot of it had to do with poor execution rather than actual intent of the policy, but regardless, Jackson has to be held accountable for that at some level. We have to be able to recognize that. Now, interestingly enough, those people who survived, if you look at Indian tribes, the Choctaws became the single wealthiest Indian tribe by the 1850s and 1860s. But then, of course, they sided with the Confederacy. And this stuff is very, very complicated. In fact, more Indians owned slaves per capita than white Americans did. We never say that to our children, right? It's just and I'm not trying to condemn anyone in particular. It just makes the story really, really complicated. There's no evidence of the rape. I was on a radio show, one of the first, and I blew it. I did a horrible job. If any of you want to see me do a terrible job at something, and hopefully I didn't tonight, but on this, if you just go onto YouTube and do Brad Birzer interview Andrew Jackson, this will pop up. And I was horrible at it. This guy came up and he said, well, Andrew Jackson's a rapist and all this, and I was so taken aback here. I'd spent all this time writing this book. I was like, what? I had not heard any of this. So I did a quick search of Andrew Jackson rapist on Google. And the first 8 of the first 10 results were of a rape in a public school called the Andrew Jackson School in Georgia. And I don't know if that's where it came from, but I'm guessing because there was nothing in his lifetime where anyone ever suggested that at all. In fact, if anything, people made fun of him for being so taken with his wife. They actually, it was one of those few things where they thought Jackson wasn't manly enough because his wife commanded him around. And she didn't command him, but they were definitely equals. No question. And I wouldn't have messed with her either. I mean, she was a fierce person. Devout, hardcore, Bible-thumping Presbyterian from day one. But I think she's amazing. And I'm shocked there aren't more books about her. And she was very liberally educated, actually, and a great writer. So I can't believe, I don't know why people haven't written about her. They should. She's a great person. So I hope that answers you. Yeah, thank you.
We have time for one more question.
Sure.
Thank you, Dr. Birzer. My question is, it's about General Jackson rallying troops to defend New Orleans. With the recent purchase of the Louisiana Territory under the Jefferson presidency, what did General Jackson have to do to win the support of the locals of New Orleans, especially with the change in loyalties?
Right. So, it's very interesting. There are a lot of things. We have a lot of good evidence about what he did there. And I would really recommend, in my book on Jackson, I only spend about 4 pages on this. I think it's really important, but I just kind of get at the mythical element. If any of you are interested, this Fox News correspondent, Brian Kilmeade, has written a book on Jackson at New Orleans, and I think it's an excellent book. It is very well researched and beautifully written, and he deals exactly with this. So I don't want to defer, I don't want to not answer your question, but really if you want to look at that, I think he's probably the best of current writers dealing with that. But Jackson, there was no doubt that there was some opposition to what he was doing, especially Jackson, when he walked into town, it's basically his town, right? He comes in with his militia, and they're not even from that area. Remember, these are Tennessee guys, right? But he's able to recruit some people within the area, but he mostly tells the citizens of New Orleans just to stay away. He doesn't want them near the battle, on his side or out. He wants his men whom he can trust. And by the way, just to get to the question that was asked a moment ago, it is very interesting. Andrew Jackson's army was mostly white Tennesseans, but about a third of it was freed blacks and Indians who were his allies. It's one of those things we don't often talk about. It's a motley crew. It's an interesting, and he even recruits some pirates, very famously, John Lafitte from the area, who decide to fight with him, and they're very successful at this. But Jackson more or less it's not official, but he more or less puts New Orleans under martial law during the time. He can't regulate it. It's something he just has to depend that they'll do. But he basically tells them, don't bother with us, we won't bother with you. And of all the people, there are crazy stories that come out of this miracle at New Orleans. But one group of New Orleans, you think about, these are French, right, and Spanish who are living there. The people who help him the most, there's a convent of nuns there who, for whatever reason, think Andrew Jackson is this great guy. And I'm guessing he treated them pretty well. And they were running food to the poor and taking care of things while he was not in town. And I had nuns in grade school. They can be wonderful and they can be fierce. And I'm sure martial law would have been preferable. So, thank you. Thank you very much, everyone.